Welcome to Lesson 13 of Introduction to Botany, and today we're going to be going over ecosystem foundations. Now, ecosystem is a geographic area where living organisms and their physical environment interact. And the components of this are biotic, so plants, animals, fungi, and bacteria, and abiotic, so soil, water, air, sunlight, and nutrients. There's a scale, which ranges from small, like a bromeliad pool, to vast, which is like prairies, forests, and deserts. And there's temporary ecosystems, which are vernal pools, like they appear in spring and disappear in summer. And there's different types of organisms in this environment, or ecosystem. There's autotrophs, which are the producers, and heterotrophs, which are the consumers. And we'll get into both of those. There's autotrophs, which is organisms that harness energy to make their own food, like sugars. The main type of this is plants through photosynthesis, which converts light into sugars. They allow up to approximately 60 billion tons of carbon converted annually. Other autotrophs can be cyanobacteria and algae. There's also chemosynthetic bacteria in deep sea ecosystems, and they use chemicals like H2S. And the role of these is that there's foundations of energy flow in all ecosystems. And then you get into heterotrophs, and these are organisms that obtain the energy by consuming others. There's herbivores, which eat the autotrophs, like deer and caterpillars that eat the plants. There's carnivores, which eat the herbivores and or other carnivores, like lions and pythons. There's omnivores, which eat plants and animals. A good example would be humans or woodpeckers. There's decomposers, which consume dead organisms like fungi, bacteria, or millipedes. There's also parasitic plants like Monotropa uniflora, and they get their energy from a fungus host. And there's different ways that these autotrophs and heterotrophs work together, like in food chains and food webs. A food chain is a linear sequence of who eats whom. A simple example would be an acorn gets eaten by a squirrel, and that squirrel gets eaten by a fox, and so on. And a food web is a complex network of interlinked food chains. So it's like what eats everything else in an entire chain of interactions. It includes all the stuff that eats everything else and how they function together. The food web example would be in tallgrass prairie in central United States. You have a base of over 400 different plant species. It's mainly grass dominant. You have herbivores like deer, bison that eat those grasses, and the insects that also eat and pollinate those grasses like butterflies, bees, and grasshoppers. You have birds like swallows and finches that eat the insects and the seeds from the plant. And then you have carnivores like the prairie king snake and red-tailed hawk that'll eat the birds and the insects. And you have decomposers like vultures, fungi, and bacteria, which recycle everything else that dies. There's also nutrient cycles versus energy flow, and this is where nutrient cycles are circular movement or recycling of elements like carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. These nutrients become more biotic, or like in plants and animals, and abiotic, like soil, air components. And you have energy flow, which is one directional. You have sun to autotrophs to heterotrophs to heat loss to environment. This cannot be recycled. It's dependent on a continual solar input. And you have plants as ecosystem foundations. The plants provide energy, habitat, and stability to ecosystems, and the loss of these foundational plants can lead to cascading effects on entire food webs. Even one tiny thing can affect everything else in a drastic scale. Like a good example would be wild tomatoes in the Atacama Desert. You have autotrophs adapted to extreme drought. It supports pollinators like bees, seed eaters like mice and rats, and predators like owls and foxes that eat the mice and rats. There's threats to this like overgrazing and mining, which allows a decline in the tomato population in the first place, which that leads to ecosystem destabilization because there's a loss of food in the chain. There's also conservation efforts to stop this, like seed banks breeding drought-resistant genes for crops, and food security that go on, but it can cause problems if there's a major loss in an ecosystem of the main producer. There's also keystone species, and these are species with a disproportionately large impact on the environment, like the saguaro cactus in the Sonoran Desert, for example. They provide habitat for woodpeckers and other birds. They produce nectar and fruit, like food for insects, lizards, rabbits, bighorn sheep, and coyotes. They bloom during the dry season, so they become a critical resource in an otherwise underabundant time period. they have a lot of challenges. So like they had high seedling mortality, long maturation. They can take over 50 years to reach a mature size, and they're vulnerable to disturbances. So they need very specific key things to happen to continue growing. And there's main conservation relevance in this, because if you don't protect keystone species, you don't preserve ecosystem integrity, and eventually that ecosystem falls apart. And like it or not, humans rely on these ecosystems too, more than a lot of us would probably like to admit. Every single thing we do, eat, use, comes from plants in some kind of way, or was greatly affected by plants in some kind of way. Even if we live in disassociated environments from a large ecosystems like forests, or if we live in cities and are away from forests, a lot of the resources that moved into that city to make that city possible still came from plants, and still has ongoing resources that come from plants in some kind of way. So if you could take away anything from this, it's that plants form the foundation of ecosystems, supporting energy flow and species interactions. Energy enters ecosystems via autotrophs, which then moves to heterotrophs and eventually dissipates as heat. Nutrients cycle continuously, and energy flows one way. There's keystone species that maintain ecosystem stability. Their loss can collapse the entire system. And conservation efforts must focus on both foundational and keystone species. I hope you like this episode of Introduction to Botany, Lesson 13. If you want to get updated on any botanical or plant content that I post in general, feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching.